Hello, students. Michael Sanchez here. Thank you so much for watching. Today, we're going to be talking about vibrato. So vibrato is something that a lot of students has questions about and struggle with. So for those of you guys that don't know, vibrato is the movement of the hand that allows you to create a nice, beautiful sound on the violin. And definitely takes some technique and some different things to do properly to eventually learn it really well and get it all vibrant. So we have a couple instructors with us today. Stephen McMullen and Mary Moser are with us. They're teachers here in the United States, as well as myself. And we're going to kind of talk about vibrato and kind of help you guys out to hopefully know at least what to work on to move forward. We have music on the website available. So if you visit that, there's a link to the music that we're going to be talking about today. Where you're going to be using the Adam Kars violin pieces. So if you're watching this on YouTube right now, you can email me at rivertownviolin@hotmail.com if you have trouble finding that link. So we're going to be using that to actually work on some of the vibrato and talk about it today. Very good. Well, let's start with Stephen and kind of ask him a little bit about what he starts talking about with students regarding vibrato. So let's say, Stephen, I've been playing a couple years and I'm interested in learning vibrato for the first time.
First, we want to make sure that your command of the map of the fingerboard is pretty good. That intonation is centered, that bow control is relatively independent, so that the thought you're putting into your vibrato activity is not detracting from some other part of your playing. So we want to make sure that certain things are firm in your understanding of how to operate the instrument. And then the vibrato itself, I heard Mary talk about all the different focal points that we can make in vibrato: arm, wrist, and finger. All of that accurate. And of course, we can't really just segregate them like in some mechanical way, separate them all out from one another. They all play a role in the overall effect of the vibrato. But I will say, I've run into some instances with young students who are desperately interested to learn vibrato, and I commend them for their effort, but they're wiggling everything that they can possibly move. And the one thing which is not moving is the tip of their finger. And so they're making a lot of effort, but the tone is still remaining just straight because the tip of the finger is not rolling. So after your hand position is good, make sure that, just without trying to make an actual vibrato, just make sure that you can roll that fingertip, that you have the right amount of tension in your arm and hand and fingers, so that it's possible to get this action going. And try it on each of the fingers. You'll notice too that the balance of the hand is a little different. We usually are almost pretty good with the second finger and the first finger. For classical players, the third finger is kind of considered the juiciest vibrato of all. But sometimes some people have a little problem with that one. The fourth finger, I think we all suffer from the same problems with the little finger, is trying to get it to be as effective as the others. And for me, the initial action of the vibrato, and I try to remember back to the time I learned it, and I was already an experienced pianist and pretty observant of how I wanted to play the violin. And so I just did it, and I've made various changes over the years, but you have to really want it, I think. And so part of it is applying the vibrato for a sustained period of time in your practice, trying not to leave any dead notes, as we would call them. And for me, the action of the vibrato can begin by learning to get a fairly regular undulation, sliding your finger on the string. And then as you reduce the amount of travel for your finger, and it sits in place, it eventually becomes a sustained tone with just the slightest little undulation, which then we can call vibrato. And that's a start. The regularity of the wave movement with your hand. I think a lot of folks get discouraged because their vibrato doesn't, because the action that they're taking doesn't immediately sound like a skilled player, and it takes an ear and it takes a muscle training to get used to the sensation of making this regular wave motion with the fingers and hand.
Thank you, Stephen, so much. For those of you guys that don't know Stephen, he's a violin instructor down in Houston, Texas. So thank you so much for joining us and giving your take on vibrato. It's very helpful. Everything you said made total sense and some great tips. For those of you guys that are interested in my take on vibrato, I highly encourage you guys to go to YouTube and type in Violin Tutor Pro Vibrato. It's a 15-minute video, and it basically talks about everything that I would think is important with vibrato, starting from step 1. So for those of you guys that just have never done it before, that's kind of a good place to start. A lot of the things you're going to be hearing today in today's class are going to be tips kind of based on if you've done it, for a little bit of time. But yeah, there's plenty to be done as far as, step by step. So that's a good video to watch. Let's now go to Mary, who's another instructor that's joining us today. Mary, tell us a little bit about vibrato as far as tension. So, I find students, a lot of times they, like Stephen said, they try to do too much. And they kind of hurt themselves just because they're not doing the proper motion. So what's your take on that regarding tension and vibrato?
Well, as he mentioned, a simple exercise is to kind of flex that knuckle, so having the first knuckle right above the nail, be able to move back and forth on all of the fingers of the left hand. You can do it on the right hand, but vibrato's not going to do much over on that side. Helps. And then with your instrument, I like the gliding motion. I actually do one. Let's see. Let's get this video. There we go. At the shoulder, and having your finger just touch the string, and then slide on top of the string. And you can see that you get that wrist motion going, and all you're doing is being on top of the string. If you suddenly tighten, and speaking of tension, and squeeze, then suddenly you can't move. So it's sort of like being able to run and skate. If you suddenly tighten up your whole body, you can't go anywhere. And I use that as a big picture of tighten your whole body and try to go somewhere, try to do something. And it's impossible to do. You can only do something if you are relaxed. So you can also use a little tissue, put a tissue on top of a string, back and forth. I'll do it a little slower. And I'm not pushing the string down. I'm just gliding right on top of it. So your hand has to be in the right position. You've got to be on top of the string. And you get the motion. You have the guide of the shoulder so that your hand is able to move. And you can do it with the second finger, the third finger, and the fourth finger. The one little warning is that with the fourth finger, it being so small, it will probably only move this much, while the first, second, and third will move that much in distance. But that's something that I do in order to get them feeling the freedom of the motion. And freedom is the key word, because if you're tight, you don't feel free, you're bound. So we're trying to get that motion to be free, and then slowly shrink it from being this big motion to smaller and smaller, so that you get just a little tiny buzz on the string. And then of course we get into much more advanced when we're able to be on it and then flex and roll the finger in the ideal motion.
Thank you, Mary, very much. So yeah, and one thing that's kind of interesting discussion to chat about too is what type of vibrato do you learn? Do you learn a forearm vibrato, which is where the entire forearm is rotating back and forth, or do you use just a wrist vibrato? One thing that teachers will definitely not say for you to do is the finger vibrato. That's incorrect. So definitely don't do that. But yeah, some instructors are going to emphasize this motion where some are going to emphasize this motion. The biggest thing that I say to students is that either one is good, but it's all about consistency. It's all about the vibrato and the motion going the same way each time back and forth. And it's sometimes the hardest to do at the very end of the note. So if you're going ba-da, 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 ba, that last one's always the tough one to get. So it's all about which one of these can you do accurately the best. My analogy on this, and Stephen, you might be a wrist vibrato guy. It's kind of like if you guys have ever played mini golf. This is the way that I always reference it. I think it's a lot easier to grab the club way up by the grip and the ball.
We put it
say that you were to grab the club way down at the bottom, it'd be a lot harder to stroke the
insurance
club.
stuff.
Oh, let me quick mute you. Okay. So that's kind of my analogy. It's kind of the same thing. Like this is a lot less accurate than what this is. That's my opinion. But I actually have some students that do a really good wrist vibrato. So it just depends on the student. Stephen, what's your take kind of on that concept of wrist versus forearm vibrato?
I think, I think our bodies are built a little bit differently. And I'll just relate a story about me. When I was playing playing a great deal and having to do a number of different performances all bunched up together, I started to realize that I was feeling a certain kind of a resistance in my arm and wrist, and some people even might say, oh, it's the beginnings of carpal tunnel or something like that. And so in analyzing what I was up to, I went to a more forearm related vibrato. And the reason I did this was to maintain a neutral position of the wrist, which I felt was a little less strenuous on all of the contents of the wrist. The strings, if you will, the strings that the muscles and the strings they're attached to, which activate our fingers and tilt our wrist, all have to go through this one tiny little channel here. And so one of the things that we can do for ourselves to alleviate strain on that is to maintain it in a neutral or a straight position so that everything flows through the channel as easily as possible. Obviously, if you put a pretty sharp bend in it, you find that operating the fingers is a little more strenuous activity. And for each person, this relationship and the angle of the arm might be a little different for each person. But for me, I found that going to a more arm-related vibrato was less strenuous on the smaller muscles, and the condition reversed itself. I'm not saying that it's a cure, but it certainly did reduce some of my efforts. Also, there's the idea that if we use a larger set of muscles to accomplish these small tasks, then perhaps we're reducing our overall effort completely. If one of the things we do when we're unfamiliar with an activity, and I noticed this in doing some weight training, that my weight trainer was easily able to grip the bars and do the exercises, where I found myself clenching the weights until I realized that I could balance them in a certain way that didn't involve this extra effort from the small muscles. So when we engage in these activities, sometimes I think in our anxiousness to get to the goal, we sometimes use sets of muscles which are smaller muscles, and so we put them under a lot of stress. And if you're more mindful about what you're doing and you analyze these things, you can transfer some of this effort to a larger section of your arm and do almost nothing and get the same amount of result. So it takes a lot of exploration. Sorry, there's just more practice time involved.
I think we'd all agree on that, that it's going to take some practice. So I thought it was very interesting what you said earlier too, Stephen, just as far as the patience side of it. I mean, every student just wants to be able to do it, and they put everything into it, and that's definitely not the way to do it.
Yeah,
So
that's what makes us start to grab or tense up, or, you know, to do things in a way which is not so healthy.
Yeah, and it's one of those things that, you know, you can easily build really bad habits that you really, it takes a ton of time to fix. So you always want to get it right the first time. That's for sure.
Yeah. Well, and it sometimes it seems to work great too. It sounds you know, if you're at that beginning stage and you associate tensing up with getting the sound that you want, then you might be kind of stuck in that channel and have to undo that later on.
Very good. Yeah, and just, you know, tensing up the hand, like Mary said, it makes it more difficult to move back and forth when there's a lot of tension going on in your hand. So, you know, it's very important to be as relaxed as possible. I really like what you guys said about the tips of the fingers. That was really good too. So very good. Well, what we're going to do now is call it a day for the YouTube video. So thank you guys so much for watching After Hours. Everybody that's in the class right now is going to be able to ask questions. So really encourage you guys to get on the video later. You don't have to be on video, but, you know, you could participate via audio or text live in the class and ask questions. Really excited about this. We're going to be covering double stops and staccato here in the next half hour. Please visit the website for future classes and see what's available for you. Hopefully you guys will learn a ton about the violin and the fiddle as well. Thank you so much for watching.